We have Ken Simonson, who's a chief economist for AGC, and he has more than 40 years experience analyzing, advocating, and communicating about economic and tax issues. He's also serves on the Census Bureau Scientific Advisory Committee. He's a fellow and past president of the National Association of Business Economics and is co-director of the Tax Economists Forum. So you get to get some really good information from the source. So with no further ado, I'd like to present Ken Simonson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time with CJE, although I know some of you, or at least your relatives. And what I want to talk about today is the general state of the economy and what that indicates for construction segments, and then something about the job market and what's happening with materials costs. I imagine most of you are familiar with AGC, but if not, we are the leading construction trade association for all types of construction other than single-family home building. We have 88 chapters that blanket the country, and collectively almost 28,000 members. About 7,000 are general contractors, and the rest are split between specialty contracting firms and suppliers of equipment, goods, and services of all types. Well, a year ago at this time, there was a lot of concern about the state of the economy. The stock market had a rather sickening drop in December. The federal government was in the midst of a 35-day shutdown, and world economy seemed to be slowing down. We had a lot of trade tensions. This week, not only is the government up and running, but so is the economy. We just saw the passage and signing of two important trade agreements. It's not the end of the friction by any means, but the tone has certainly changed, and there are signs that other economies are also picking up speed. Well, contractors never lost their optimism. AGC of America does a survey every fall in conjunction with SAGE, and to me, the key question in this Hiring and Business Outlook survey is, do you expect the dollar value of projects available to bid on to be higher or lower than the year before? And what we've seen for both of the last 2 years is that for each of the 13 market segments we ask about, more people think the market will expand than shrink. We measure this through taking the percentage of respondents who believe it's going to expand minus the percentage who think it's going to shrink, and portray that as a net reading. So the first number you see in front of each of these segments is the net reading, and you can see that it's positive for every one of them. Everything on the left-hand column is more positive than it was a year ago. The first number is the 2020 outlook. The one after that is the outlook we had a year ago. So interestingly, the most positive response, net response, was for water and sewer construction. Much more positive than a year ago. 25 percentage points more positive this year than negative. Last year, 14% more positive. Very strongly positive on bridge, highway, K-12 school, and hospital construction. And again, more positive than last year. Also transportation construction. This covers a variety of modes, airports, transit, rail, both intercity and commuter rail, and port projects. Power construction, also quite strongly positive, tied this year with projects for a variety of federal agencies. And then quite positive also about higher education. For the remaining categories, not as strongly positive, but still more think the market will grow than shrink. For the last four, though, a little less optimistic than they were a year ago. Well, here's what's happened since the beginning of 2006. The peak in construction before the recession actually happened in February of 2006, and construction spending put in place. This is a series the Census Bureau puts out each month that measures the spending on projects underway. Construction began to decline well over a year before the overall economy. and it had a 5-year decline, so much worse than the so-called Great Recession. It then grew for 7 years in a row, but topped out at the beginning of 2018, and since then has kind of bobbed up and down. So you might not think construction is doing well, but you really need to peel that onion to see what's happening below the surface, and that's what the 3 lines below the top show. The red line is residential construction. That's the one that went into recession right away in 2006, declined steeply until 2009, had a brief recovery thanks to a provision in the stimulus legislation that passed that spring, and then really flatlined for a few more years. So the recovery on residential didn't get going until 2012. And last year, we actually saw quite a drop-off in single-family home building until interest rates came down late in the year. The blue line shows private non-residential construction, and that kept going strongly until the financial crisis and the recession hit in the fall of 2008, and then briefly declined as steeply as residential had before beginning an upturn in 2011 that lasted until a couple of years ago, and since then it has been pretty close to flat for a couple of years. But you can see not much variation. The blue bar at the right shows that from November of 2018 to November of last year, private non-residential was up just 0.2%, essentially flat, and it was only 2 percentage points below its peak, which was set in September of 2018. Finally, the smallest category, public construction, actually kept going right into the recession, thanks to spending on buildings that had been authorized by bond issues before the recession, other major projects that were already funded, and the effective federal stimulus money, which helped keep public construction going for a couple of more years. But after that, it tapered off. State and local budgets were really tight for a long time. Late in 2018, though, public construction really started gearing up, and you can see that it reached a peak in April of 2019 and has stayed close to that peak. It's actually 12% above the previous peak, but 12% up in the latest year. Very strong growth from November of 2018 to November of 2019, but it is 0.2% below the peak, which was in April. Well, let me go from there into more detail on these non-residential categories. This table shows total public and private non-residential spending combined, and it's ordered in descending order of the categories defined by the Census Bureau. First thing to take away from this is the top line shows that total public and private non-residential spending in 2018 was 3.7% higher than in 2017. I'd call that modest growth because this represents current dollar spending. We don't have a single deflator to take a building and pipeline, power plant construction, and convert it to the same units. So we're only looking at current dollars here. In 2019, we have data through November, and those first 11 months were just 2.5% higher than in the first 11 months of 2018. My forecast for this year is that we will continue to see growth. It may be minimal, but I think it could top the 2018 growth rate by a little bit. But there are big differences year over year in each of these categories. Look first at that 2018 column, and you can see that everything was positive with 2 minor exceptions. 3% drop in power construction, 1% drop in healthcare construction. In 2019, also 2 negatives, but they were quite different. One of them was retail construction went from a moderate positive growth to just falling through the floor, down 25%. And then warehouse construction, which had been the strongest category in 2018, suddenly turned negative, though only slightly. Well, for 2020, I think we're going to have three standout categories. Taking them from the top, the first strong one is power and energy construction. The Census Bureau calls this power, and it does include every kind of power generation, whether it's coal, nuclear, gas-fired power plants, renewables such as wind, solar, hydropower in some parts of the country, and then transmission lines, local electric distribution. But then census combines two unrelated things too, the construction around oil and gas wells and pipelines. So for 2020, I think there's a prospect of significant pipeline construction. The timing is very uncertain. These things can always be held up by court appeals or regulatory decisions, but there are a lot of projects that could go forward, and when they do, they spend at a tremendous rate. Second, we expect to see some more massive solar projects and also larger scale wind projects, perhaps even offshore wind off the Atlantic coast, and a number of natural gas-fired power plants. Another big growth category, highway and street construction. You can see this was very strong in 2019. In fact, in the first part of the year, it was posting 20% gains over early 2018. No thanks to the federal government. In spite of all of the rhetoric starting on election night 2016, continuing on Inauguration Day, and with so many proclamations of Infrastructure Week that it became a running gag for late-night comedy hosts, we haven't seen any breakthrough on federal funding for infrastructure or limited to highways. However, over the last decade, 33 states have increased their tax rates for highway purposes or found other ways to dedicate funds to highways. And this has finally reached a point that we are seeing a significant increase in bid lettings by state DOTs. In addition, we have more states than previously going ahead with toll projects, either through traditional toll agencies or public-private partnerships. So I think we'll see another year of strong growth in highway, street, and bridge construction. Third area that I think will do well is the diverse transportation market. For a number of years, the growth was in airport construction, and we're still seeing massive projects at hub airports around the country. But I think the level of activity has kind of plateaued now. Instead, the growth lately has been in transit systems, whether it's extending lines in the Los Angeles area, the Puget Sound area, or massive reconstruction, as we're seeing with the Chicago, the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, Philadelphia, and some other systems, Boston. And there are also selective examples of significant private investment in transportation, whether it's airlines adding gates, upgrading their club areas, and their increasing maintenance facilities, or railroad investment, including some high-speed or higher-speed passenger rail that's being at least partly privately financed in Florida, in Texas, possibly from Las Vegas to Victorville, California. So I think the transportation market will remain strong again this year. In terms of moderate growth, I think we will see an increase in educational spending. That was the largest category in the last 2 years. Barely grew, but here again, you have to peel back the outer layer of the onion to see what's going on. So let me switch to a graph that breaks this down. It's actually a two-part graph. On the left side, you see the annual total from 2008, which was the peak year for most non-residential categories, through 2017. And then there's an expanded view of the monthly total, but the Census Bureau takes that raw figure and they adjust for the fact that there's always a difference between a given month and an average month. And so that seasonal adjustment, they then multiply by 12 in order to give you what's called a seasonally adjusted annual rate that enables me to put the monthly numbers on the same scale as the annual total. And then I've put in a dashed line to show you how that latest month, in this case November 2019, compares with the previous months in 2018 and 19 and the previous annual totals. And you can see that the educational spending overall was running above the previous months and all previous years back to 2010. So it's definitely coming back. But looking farther down, there's quite a difference in the stories. State and local pre-K through 12 spending is back to nearly the 2008 level. As property values have increased and home building has finally begun to pick up, we're seeing more properties added to tax rolls, much higher valuations, and therefore more property tax receipts, and more willingness on the part of property owners or on the part of voters to pass bond issues for new schools or school reconstruction. And indeed, the school market has shifted. Before the recession, we were getting brand new subdivisions, places like here in the Valley of the Sun in Las Vegas, the Inland Empire in California, were growing like crazy, and those places all needed schools to go with the new homes. Well, in this decade, much more of the population has stayed put in cities, even when they have school-age kids, or in older suburbs. So more of that school construction money is going into expansion of existing schools or reconstruction. Where I live in D.C., practically every school has been rebuilt and sometimes added on to. We are starting to see home building expand into new areas, so I think this year the mix will shift back a little bit to new schools, but it's still going to be much more heavily on the reconstruction and expansion side. Farther down, you see a red line for state and local higher education, and this line has stayed relatively flat throughout the decade, including the last 2 years. And then private education rebounded for several years, but has tailed off in the last 2 years. A couple things that are happening here are, first of all, the demographics. We're no longer seeing a rising population of high school seniors. That peaked about a decade ago. So fewer first-time candidates for colleges. Second, with the strong job market, people who graduate either from high school or community college or who are laid off from a job, they're no longer going on to get a new degree or certificate. They're able to get a job right away. And third, the number of foreign students who have really bolstered the finances of both state and private colleges and universities, that's starting to drop off as the administration has actively made it more difficult for people to get visas to come to college or to stay after they've gotten a degree, or just discouraged people from thinking that this is the place to come. So those trends are likely to hold down investment in new dorms, classrooms, and other higher ed facilities. So I think we will see a mixed market again in educational construction and only modest increase. Well, while I'm on this, and then at the bottom of the slide, I show the percentage change from November of last year to November of this year in the total 7% and in each of those subcategories. Over on the right is healthcare construction. Now, this is a market that has not consistently grown. You can see the W shape in the annual portion, and that that has continued over the last year. Looks almost like a cardiogram there, and not too healthy either, with the dashed line staying right in the middle of the last couple of years. Well, again, you need to disaggregate because previously the bulk of that market was in hospital construction, but you can see that's actually down at pretty much its lowest point this decade. Instead, much more health care is being delivered through those standalone urgent care centers that you may see the signs along the highway telling you how many minutes till you can get visited, outpatient surgical centers, rehab, and hospices, as well as clinics inside big box strip malls and shopping and drugstores. So there is still a lot of projects, but they're much smaller. And in fact, a lot of rural and community hospitals are closing their doors. Last year, according to Bloomberg, there were 30 bankruptcies among hospitals and far more that were losing money and at risk of closing. So I think these trends are going to hold down the total dollars on health care spending for at least through 2020 and perhaps longer. Well, let me go back to the table one more time. The fourth biggest category, office construction, did pretty well in 2018 and 2019. But this is partly, I think, due to deceptive classification. The Census Bureau categories are decades old. In fact, in my role on the Census Scientific Advisory Committee at our last meeting, I recommended that Census create a working group to look at ways of improving construction statistics. And we're still waiting for the director to approve that, but if so, my #1 priority will be to get data centers broken out. Right now, they're mostly in office. Some may be showing up in other categories. We know there's been huge amount of data center construction in many parts of the country, but we don't know if it's growing or not. However, it certainly appears that general office construction, the ones with people in it instead of just electrons, that is no longer growing the way it did a few years ago when you had a lot of companies moving their headquarters from small towns to big metro areas, or in some cases from outer suburbs to be where the millennials wanted to live and work. Instead, companies, to the extent that they are relocating or consolidating space, they're putting workers in ever smaller spaces. They're telling people you can work from home, from a co-working space or a coffee shop. When you come in, we'll assign you to a desk, not your own office. So I think the outlook for office construction is fairly limited this year, and much more of the money may be in rebuilding older spaces than putting up glitzy new towers. Manufacturing construction is a category that seemed poised for takeoff at the beginning of 2018 after passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provided both carrots and sticks for companies to relocate in the U.S. But before the ink was dry, the president started slapping on tariffs, and that may have helped a few steel and aluminum producers, but it was bad news for the far larger number of firms that use imported materials to do their own production. And so the market for manufacturing really got stalled both by the actual tariffs raising costs, by the increase in threatened costs from possible future tariffs, and also the retaliatory action that suddenly shut U.S. producers out of certain foreign markets or made them uncompetitive. That situation may have eased a little bit this week with the passage of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and a first stage trade agreement with China, but there's still a lot of tariffs in place, a lot of retaliatory actions, and uncertainty as to what will happen next on tariffs. So I think manufacturing is likely to remain quite feeble in 2020 in terms of actual construction going ahead. Then we have two categories that were pretty strong, very strong in 2018, warehouse and lodging. As I mentioned, warehouse actually turned a little bit negative in 2019. But this, as with healthcare, is a bit deceptive in that probably the total number of projects increased again, but instead of seeing the massive 1 to 2 million square foot distribution centers at the edge of metro areas, much more of the work is taking place at so-called click and collect points inside metro areas where the deliveries are only for the last mile or the last hour. And those are on much more expensive real estate, but they're so much smaller that the total dollars going into the warehouse construction category may actually be flat this year as it was last year. And then finally, lodging had double-digit growth for years, right through 2018. It's slowly tapering off. There's still some places that it looks like there are a lot of hotel projects underway. This week, the Federal Reserve's Beige Book, which is a summary of surveys, informal surveys that the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks do with businesses of all types, mentioned that in Boston there are a huge number of lodging projects underway as well as ones planned. But this is a category that's very vulnerable to a couple of things. First, if interest rates jump up, a lot of these projects may not pencil out and developers will halt them or not go ahead. And second, if there's any pause in the growth of leisure and business travel and international travelers coming to the U.S., then the vacancy rate or the occupancy rates are likely to tail off. And developers look very closely at a weekly figure that surveys all the hotel chains on average daily room rates and occupancy rates. The product of those, known as revenue per available room, or RevPAR, has been fluctuating around year-ago levels for quite some time. If it turns negative on a consistent basis, then I could see lodging construction actually dropping off over the next year. Well, I do have graphs on all of these and multiple divisions of some of them, but rather than spending more time on this, I'd be glad to come back to any category that you may be interested in. I have bullet points discussing some of the things that I talked about or didn't get to, but let me move on to the labor situation. Well, first let me say a little bit about residential. You may not be in the single-family market, but that certainly has an influence on other types of construction, not least of all on multifamily. This morning, the government put out its monthly figures on housing starts and building permits. And it was quite a year-end gift. The December numbers, total number of starts, jumped to the highest level in 13 years. Now, these numbers are volatile. They may be revised down, but clearly we've seen a strong upward trend in the last few months as long-term mortgage rates have dropped by nearly a full percentage point to a range that means many more people can now qualify for mortgages, or they don't feel rate locked. People who were in a house that they really wanted to move, but they didn't want to give up that 4.5% mortgage. Now they can get a 30-year mortgage for 3 5/8, or a 15-year mortgage for just 3 1/4. And so I think we will see a lot more people moving and more people becoming first-time home buyers. We've already started to see that trend in single-family construction. The red line on the left shows an upturn in single-family put in place in the second half of 2019. Usually, when more people are moving into single-family homes, particularly for the first time, that's bad news for the occupancy rate in multifamily and therefore for construction of new apartments. But in this case, the market is much more mixed. Some of those people who are moving out of single-family homes, they are giving up having to take care of a lawn or shovel snow or fix the roof. They're moving into multifamily buildings and single-level living. So I think there will be a demand from the very large number of seniors ready to give up single-family homes. And also, you do have millennials and people younger than that who 20 years ago might have jumped into home ownership right away, but now they're still not sure that they want to commit to that. They saw what happened to people who bought a home in 2006 thinking they could flip it at any time, and instead they were stuck with it, or worse, lost their home. And there's still a lot who have high student debt or other credit impairments that will keep them from qualifying for a mortgage. So I think there will be at least modest demand for multifamily housing going forward in 2020, and very strong demand for single family, perhaps double-digit growth in single family construction, and as strong as 5% growth in multifamily. Well, let me switch gears and talk about the labor market situation. And I like to set this up by showing this map of population growth. The top line shows that U.S. population grew by 0.48% in 2019. That was the lowest growth rate since 1918, a year in which we had hundreds of thousands of people out of the country fighting World War I, and almost no immigration because of World War I. This past year, we did see several different reasons that the population growth slowed so much. The birth rate continued to drop. It's now below replacement levels, meaning that eventually U.S. population would shrink if not for immigration. The death rate increased, partly because more people are living into their 80s, 90s, and beyond, and naturally you have a higher number of deaths in that age category. But sadly also, we see increased deaths among working age adults from either substance abuse or suicide. And then net immigration has dropped a lot. In just the last 3 years, it went from 1.1 million to under 600,000, mostly as a result of unfriendly immigration policy. Well, I think all of those trends are likely to stay in place for the next several years, and so are the general colors on this map. Here you see 10 states in deep red, meaning they had a population loss. For a couple of them, Illinois and West Virginia, it was the 6th straight year of population decline. All of the states in the Northeast, the midsection of the country, and a couple of other areas were either losing population or having very slow growth. They're in pink, meaning growth of less than 0.5%. Instead, the above average growth is occurring in the Southeast, Texas, Colorado, Washington, and particularly in the Rocky Mountain states. Those are the ones in deep green with growth of more than 1.5%. And they're being helped partly by higher birth rates in states with a high concentration of Mormons, such as Utah and Idaho, but also the fact that California has gone in just 5 years from above average growth, 0.9% in 2014, to a mere 0.1% growth. It's not that California is having a higher death rate increase or a lower, more of a drop in the birth rate, but out-migration of people who are living in California and just say, I can't take it anymore in terms of the excessive housing costs, excessive commuting times, a difficulty of doing business, and unfortunately, a never-ending succession of natural disasters. So the out-migration rate, particularly to those western states, but also to Texas and many other states, has really surged. So I think generally these colors are going to remain the same for the next few years. However, construction is in much better shape. This map shows that construction employment increased in 39 states plus D.C. from November of last year, November of 2018 to November of 2019. May look like I don't know how many states there are. It should say 11 states down, not 12. Generally, this map has stayed in that same range of 37 to 44 states in the green on a year-over-year basis every month last year. In fact, I think we would see even more states in the green if there were enough workers available. The graph on the left shows a series that has my favorite acronym, JOLTS, the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey. We just got November figures this morning, and they show a continuation of this pattern that I have here for October. This is a snapshot of the last decade. Just October figures show that hires soared to nearly 500,000. Now, that's obviously not additions, net additions. Nearly as many people left construction firms as were hired. But the key point is that job openings jumped to the record level for October in a series that goes all the way back to the end of 2020. So contractors, while they are hiring at a greater rate than the overall economy, they still would hire far more people if they were available. In fact, our survey shows that 75% of the 956 respondents in our survey said they plan to add workers this year. But 81% of the firms said they had difficulty finding those workers last year, and nearly 2/3 think it will be as difficult or even more difficult this year. And I think the latest JOLTS numbers confirm that expectation is correct, that job openings keep setting records for a given month, every single month. What are the consequences for owners? 44% of our respondents said that costs were higher than anticipated, presumably because they were having to pay workers more, pay more overtime, or also that jobs were taking longer than anticipated, according to 40% of the firms. So as a result, 41% now are putting higher prices into bids or contracts. And while I don't show it on a bar here, 23% said that they're quoting longer completion times in new bids and contracts. Firms are trying a variety of ways to make up for that labor shortage. 32% of the respondents said that they were using labor-saving equipment, drones, robots, 3D printers, laser or GPS-guided equipment. 28% were turning to ways of reducing the number of labor hours on the job site, whether through lean construction, BIM and scheduling, and off-site production. But that also means that they have to add new specialists, whether it's architects or BIM or lean construction personnel, drone operators, and so forth. Let me close by talking about what's happening with materials costs. Both of these graphs show the change over a 2-year period in the producer price index for 8 widely used components of construction. On the left are items that are globally sourced or produced or used in a lot of other industries. And the pink bars show the change in the producer price index from November of 2017 to November of 2018. That was a period where we had that 25% steel tariff, 10% aluminum tariff, many other items subject to tariff. And we saw immediate price increases by domestic producers or service centers. So steel mill products went up 21%, the producer price index. Aluminum mill shapes up 7%. There was also a big spike in oil prices, and diesel fuel prices went up 18%. Now copper, which was not subject to tariff and is really considered a bellwether of general economic conditions, those prices actually went down 10% in that year. In the latest 12 months, from November of 2018 to November of 2019, the red bars show dramatic change. We had a 15% drop in steel mill prices. That's because not only were there no new tariffs, but last summer the president removed the tariffs on Mexican and Canadian steel. We also had a slump in global demand in U.S. car production, other sources of demand for steel and aluminum. And then oil prices came back down, so diesel prices also took a big tumble. On the right side, you see 4 items that are generally produced in the U.S. or even locally and used primarily by construction. And none of these had double-digit increases in prices in the previous year. The one that came closest is one tied to crude oil, somewhat loosely, asphalt paving mixtures. In the latest year, because of that slump in home building and in retail construction, you had a drop in the prices for lumber and gypsum products, and a pretty steady demand for concrete. Going forward, now that we're seeing a resumption of single-family home building, I think those prices are going to pick up again. And I think we've probably hit the bottom in many other prices. Well, here's what's happened to all of the inputs, both for materials and services, and also labor costs. The blue line shows a producer price index for all inputs to every type of construction. And here I've done a cumulative change rather than single bars for each year. In 2016, 2017, we had gradually accelerating prices for materials and services used in construction. Big spike in the first 8 months of 2018, and since then those prices have fluctuated as tariffs have come off and other changes. But the cumulative change over almost 4 years, 12.3%. The red line shows average hourly earnings, that's wages and salaries for all construction workers, and that's been marching up at a fairly steady 2.3 to 3% year-over-year change, cumulative total 12% increase. Now there is a PPI for new non-residential buildings of 5 types. I call it a bid price index because the Bureau of Labor Statistics asks the same group of contractors each month, what would you charge to put up the same buildings that we asked you about a month and a year ago? And this index stayed almost flat in 2016. It climbed at roughly the same rate as the labor and purchased input costs in 2017. By the end of 2018, those bid prices were moving up faster and had passed the cumulative increase in wage costs. And then in the last few months, they've actually moved a little ahead of the purchased input costs also. Well, I'm not going to forecast what contractors will charge this year. That's neither appropriate nor legal for me to do. But I do have my fearless forecast for the amount of work out there and the costs to contractors. Total spending, I think, will rise at least slightly after finishing last year just about flat. And the mix is certainly changing. In 2018, very consistent growth in spending on residential, private, non-residential, and public. Last year, huge divergence with that drop-off in single-family residential and a big jump in public construction. This year, I think we're coming back to convergence, that single-family, multifamily, both up, so total residential should be growing at least mid-single digits. Slight growth in private non-residential, tapering off, but still positive change in public construction. Goods and services input, we got a break in the cost increase in that index last year. We're likely to get back to where we were in 2018 as economic growth picks up again and also as demand for things used in residential construction pushes up the prices of things like lumber and gypsum after they had slumped last year. And then wages and salaries in the particular period shown here, November to November, pretty moderate increase. Now economists, including me, have been over forecasting the increase in wages, and so this could be on the high side to say we'll have as much as 3.5% to 4.5% increase. But really this understates the total labor-related costs. Companies are certainly spending more to go out and recruit workers, to train them, to pay for overtime to train them or to make up for the missing workers. And the workers that they do hire, generally a lower skill level, perhaps no construction experience. So what we call the unit labor cost, the amount of production per labor hour, probably is rising more rapidly than it was. So that's my forecast. I'm sticking to it till I get new data. When I do, I'll put it in the Data Digest, my weekly one-page summary of economic news relevant to construction. I'm happy to add any of you to the email list if you want. Just take my card or email me at ken.simonson@agc.org. I'll be glad to send you the full set of slides in addition. And we have fact sheets on our website, agc.org, for each state. So just click on the state on the map that you want to see. Each month I put out a set of tables that shows the change in about 60 or 70 producer price indexes. So you can follow what's happened to the cost of your favorite material, or if you're trying to show an owner what contractors are charging relative to a year ago. We have each of those 5 separate non-residential building indexes for schools, healthcare, office, warehouse, and industrial. And then there are 4 indexes for subcontractor types: roofing, electrical, plumbing, and concrete. With that, I'll be glad to take questions if you want. I'll also be around for a little while if you're too shy to ask an economist a question in front of your peers. I'm used to having people come up afterwards, and often the question is the same that their peers would have asked.
Well, great. So there were. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We really appreciate you being here. Thank you. And you go
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.